So thank you for listening to the Mental Insights podcast. This is your host, Brennan Catuli. We are here with Ashley for episode number 39. Thank you for taking the time out with me to be on the Mental Insights podcast, Ashley. I truly appreciate you taking this time out and sharing your insights with my audience here today.
Oh, thank you for having me and all that you're doing, Brendan. I really appreciate it, the opportunity to talk about all of this.
Definitely. It's my pleasure. And it's something that I definitely think we can truly dive into. And to start with my guest, the first question to really wrap into what brought you into the field, I always ask, when did you truly learn about the importance of mental health, and what did it bring in terms of awareness, or just the idea that you wanted to be passionate within the field of mental health?
Mm-hmm. Oh, I feel like I was so fortunate in many ways to grow up in a family system that really valued mental health, and I know that that's somewhat unique, at least given my generation. And so, for example, I lost my great-grandmother. She lived with us for the first few years of my life because she was battling a lot of illnesses. And so she eventually passed away when I was very young. I think I was 4 at the time, and was really struggling with a lot of grief around that. And that was kind of coming up through, I think, probably behavioral stuff and talking back to my mom and all that good stuff, the way that kids express their emotions. And I remember my mom actually taking me to see a play therapist at the time. And I mean, I just reflect back on the fact that I think it's really unique and telling that she had the insight and awareness to know that I was struggling, that I wasn't processing this well. I needed, some additional support other than what she could give me. So I just share that as an example of it was something that was really valued within my family. And that to me kind of made all the difference in terms of being able to talk about mental health, to have, emotions acknowledged, and didn't mean that I didn't continue to struggle myself. I certainly did. And so therapy actually was a pretty regular part of my life from an early age. I think I struggled with depression and anxiety. I was somebody, I think, prone from the day I was born to be maybe more highly anxious. And so definitely got support for that along the way about how to manage that. And so I remember going to the library as a kid. The other thing was that I was a total nerd, and which I now can say with a lot of pride. Probably at the time I didn't appreciate it about myself, but my favorite place to hang out was the library, and I would check out these books on Sigmund Freud when I was 9 years old, and
That's incredible.
Totally nerdy, and I'm sure I didn't understand most of it, but I did. I think because of my upbringing, I had this real fascination with, why people make the decisions that they do, and just I think I craved understanding, and so I knew that I wanted to be in this field for a long, long time. Then I got to college, and I thought I think brushed that aside, played around with a bunch of other things, and then came back to it, fortunately, because I think it was my deep kind of calling. And I think what ended up happening, which I think we'll get into, is just really recognizing that my other kind of deep passion was in supporting women and girls. And it was important to me to figure out how to blend the ideas of empowering girls and women to, live to their fullest potential while through the means of kind of psychological science and mental health. So that's a long answer, but it's been something I think from day one that has always been kind of part of my own mission.
Thank you so much for sharing that. And, as you were speaking and sharing what you've been able to experience, it really brought up a topic that I've, seen throughout the internet recently. And one being that a lot of people are curious about, I think, is, especially for yourself, you've had the experience of therapy before you've become a professional for other people. And
Yeah.
oftentimes a lot of people say, does a therapist still struggle with the same issues as,
Mm.
other people? Do they still have some signs of anxiety, or do they still have depressive episodes? And I think, this can be a good time for you to share, as you've transitioned to being in a mental health professional role, can you speak about, still the emotions that you feel and still what you're able to, become aware of yourself and try to, hash out that thought process that, whether it's a therapist or a psychologist, that, once they know all of the answers, that they're not necessarily just, fixed and a perfect being. So can you share about your own experience throughout this process?
Yeah. I'm so glad you're bringing that up because it's such an important, I think, and relevant topic. And so I think I definitely want to share about my own experience. But even just to start, I think that our field as a whole, and the various fields that kind of comprise, mental health and mental wellness, have really evolved. Really, certainly even since I've been in graduate school. And I think in such important ways. I think that without getting like too historical, so much of probably most fields, but particularly psychology and mental health, our understanding of how it works and what's curative and all of those things was really built on a lot of narrow views, particularly through, older white males, and through those lenses, and not really incorporating diverse experiences, or especially our own humanity. And so I think that we're kind of catching on to that, and recognizing that, I think we thought that the, patient professional relationship was built on this idea that the professional had this expertise, that was this blank slate, that had sort of figured things out for themselves, and that, of course, we all know human beings just isn't feasible or plausible. We all struggle with all kinds of things. We never expect our physician to not have a knee problem or a heart condition, or to have life all figured out. So I think actually an early experience that I had when I was coming out of graduate school was I had gotten an offer for a postdoc, which is, the final step in becoming a psychologist. And I haven't shared this very widely, but what happened was I had recently started a blog, and at the time, and I had on my blog, I was talking about, mental health, especially in the field of eating disorders and body image, which is kind of my realm. And the blog wasn't really a personal blog about myself, but I would incorporate some anecdotes and, experiences that I have had, and things like that. And meanwhile, I was, getting ready to move to this new city to start this postdoc at a very prestigious hospital. And I got this call and said, "We found your blog and we're rescinding your offer for this postdoc." And I was devastated at the time. And I remember feeling like just so ashamed initially, because I talked with them about, what exactly was it about. We don't have any tolerance for any self-disclosure. We wouldn't want any of our patients to be aware that you had, been in therapy at some point, or and that was such this pivotal moment for me, because I remember thinking, well, initially, to be honest, I thought, what a horrible mistake I made to put, personal information about myself out there, to like be a person. I should know better. And then it honestly took me some time to recognize what a gift that was, that I didn't end up in this system that reinforced this idea that, that we don't all have mental health and wellness to attend to. So like I said before, therapy has been part of my own life, I mean, for a long, long time, and on and off. I haven't necessarily consistently been in therapy, but during hard moments in my life, I certainly know that that's a tool and a resource that's really powerful for me. And I, at transition points, particularly like over the years of having children and are navigating, marital issues or anxiety creeping up. I struggled with postpartum anxiety after a few of my children were born. And, I feel fortunate to know that that's something I can turn to. And um, I think that, during graduate school, I remember that we were never required, but we were strongly encouraged to seek our own therapy. And so, I mean, I sort of have that bias too, that I really hope that there aren't people out there doing this work that haven't also had the experience of sitting in the shoes of someone who is coming to you vulnerable, seeking support, whether or not you've had a diagnosable mental health issue. I just think that, we need to put ourselves in the shoes of people that are reaching out and really experiencing these issues. So it's been really important to me.
Thank you for that. And it's
Yeah.
definitely so important to see that other perspective, because you won't be able to connect or understand their approach to, seeking out your own services and truly gaining that connection of them feeling comfortable and feeling that awareness of what the next step is. You spoke about kind of the hierarchy of what we have within our society, and it certainly trickled down in order to see that we have many of these, approaches to how we deal with our mental health care, and there's many different, perspectives that are still driving much of this throughout our society.
Mm-hmm.
Within this perspective, you spoke about how you are really focusing on empowering women. So, can you speak about what was kind of the first awareness that you had that you wanted to direct your attention towards women, and kind of what challenged and inspired you to want to take that realm and open up to that side of, helping women heal throughout their different experiences, whether it's an eating disorder or another mental health challenge?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I somewhat similar to my mental health passion story. I would say that I was probably also born a feminist, and I think it's unfortunate that word isn't as embraced as maybe it once was. To me, it just means equal treatment of all human beings. But I also grew up in a family system that was really attuned to issues of social inequality, and in a community that was. And so, and I feel really blessed for that, because while I certainly have had tons of privilege myself, that I always think is important to acknowledge, and over time I've had to come to continue to learn to see certain injustices. I think I was trained at least to look for them, and be aware. And so, from early on, I just saw pretty clearly at times how, women were, well, girls and women, particularly girls, even in growing up, were treated differently based on their sex or gender identity. And I identify as a woman. And so felt that really personally, and, experienced certainly some of that marginalization in different ways. And so, I knew that it was important to me to figure out how to not just be a sort of passive experiencer of that, and wanting to kind of create change, and meanwhile wanting, like I was saying before, to sort of understand why people make the decisions that they do and how do they sort of cope. And I think one thing that I recognized, maybe I'm even just still recognizing, is that the field of psychology in particular, I think, has traditionally been very individually focused. It's been very sort of centered on how do we sort of heal the illness of an individual, some kind of psychological illness, at least clinical psychology, I should say. And so I think while I was really drawn to psychology, I was also kind of questioned and challenged that idea a bit, that every sort of problem was like centered within the person themselves. Because I think when we take a wider lens, oftentimes the issues that we kind of quote unquote diagnose are actually symptoms of, broader cultural issues, or make a lot of sense in the context of, trauma, or experiencing marginalization or disempowerment, or all of that. So I think that that's kind of where I've found my own passion in doing this work, is working with primarily individuals, although also sometimes groups and systems, to sort of recognize what we all have a responsibility to take charge of our own mental health, but what maybe sort of is centered within us, what is a cultural or systemic issue that we may be able to, impact on, and maybe we can't. And in that situation, what do we do? So I love working with girls and women. I love working with young women in particular, just because there's so much just hope, and it's incredibly inspiring to me to work with this population, particularly when they're struggling with issues of doubting their own self-worth, and how that might translate into disordered eating or self-injury behaviors, or other kinds of maladaptive behaviors, because I think being able to address those manifestations of those kind of more maybe core beliefs that a lot of times are kind of culturally indoctrinated is so powerful. When you can help somebody work through that, then it's like their potential is limitless, which is so cool to see. So I love it.
That's awesome. That's so great to hear. And, you do see a big kind of impact within, the society of eating disorders, specifically within women as well. And that's something that I think you are taking a large forefront within the work that you do. And obviously this, idea of nutrition, of just food, causes a very big displacement within many people's health. And, can you touch upon whether it's a specific cause to why we're seeing so much of these issues of an eating disorder today, or maybe it's just the impact that, nutrition and the ideas that the challenge that eating disorders cause within someone's life, can displace on their own health in general?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the rates of eating disorders have, it's hard to really assess whether the prevalence of eating disorders is going up or down or staying stable sort of within our societies, just because it appears that they're not slowing down in terms of diagnosis, but in a lot of ways, like with a lot of mental health issues, that's actually really a positive thing, because it means that we're doing earlier identifying, these issues in people that maybe we would have missed before, like in males or older adults and younger children and things like that. But I think even to take it out of the sort of clinically diagnosed eating disorder realm, I think culturally our relationships with food are quite disordered. And I think that it's rare, in my opinion, to find people that don't struggle in some way in their relationship with nutrition and food, or their relationship to their body. And so I mean, I think that there's a lot of drivers of that. I think as one in particular that I end up talking a lot about is just the prevalence of weight stigma in our society. Weight stigma in particular is sort of considered one of the last kind of acceptable stigmas, if you will, in terms of, there's lots of research to show that people feel very justified in discriminating against people of larger body sizes. And a lot of that comes down to the fact that we inaccurately assume that people's body size is a direct kind of correlation to the way that they eat or or certain personality characteristics. We assume all these sort of negative qualities of people that are living in larger bodies. And so as a result of that, I mean, how wouldn't we, if we are essentially shaming and blaming people for the way that they look and they live, for us to have a pretty screwed up relationship with how we eat or how we treat our bodies. There's all kinds of kind of like cultural and systemic issues with, access to quality food, et cetera, that I think come into play as well. And meanwhile, I mean, to kind of that first part of your question, nutrition has a huge impact just generally on our mental health. There's like all kinds of super interesting research on the gut-brain axis and the way that our digestive systems impact our neurotransmitters, which drive, feelings of depression and anxiety and behaviors and decision-making. So it's this, whole, I'm going to call it a new field because it's getting attention, even though, I know all the researchers who have been doing this work have been saying, we've been looking at this forever. No one's been paying attention. But it's really exciting that it's getting a lot more attention, and we're understanding that our brain isn't just in our head, it's in our stomach, and in the rest of our body, and our mental wellness kind of relates to how we treat our whole body. Something I see in particular, just to kind of give one example, is kind of the impact of low carbohydrate diets, which is a whole pet peeve of mine. We could do a whole episode on that, but in particular because carbohydrates are so important for brain functioning, and they're a huge mechanism by which we kind of regulate serotonin, which is related to all kinds of mood and anxiety functioning for ourselves. So when we, restrict how much carbohydrates we're getting and we're not getting enough, among other problems, our brains aren't working optimally. But we're often not talking about that. We're talking about all these sort of low carb diets and, making bread sound like it's like the worst evil in the world. So I would want to put a plug in for bread because it's great. It's important. It's going to help your mental health. Don't cut your carbohydrates. And there's just a ton of interesting stuff out there about how important looking at our nutrition is for how we feel mentally as well as, of course, physically.
Awesome. Thank you for that. And there's a few things that I really want to touch on as you spoke. And, first being, I think that relation between your gut and your mind is definitely something so important. And the research is clearly out there. Obviously, when people say trust your gut in terms of making decisions, that's a huge relation to, what we've known that, that directly accesses a lot of the, intuitions that you may have. As well, you spoke about the diets and having a low carb diet, and we see all these other things of, the keto, the vegan, any type of scenario where it's like cutting out certain things. And, I find a lot of, harm with that because it's leading people to believe that that's going to, the one instance like you talked about, lose weight, which is a big phenomenon, or as well, they think it's just going to make them feel better or get more fit. But to circle that back, we're speaking about how the gut health is what's most important for your brain function. There's this company called Viome, which actually tests your gut health, and they try to give you recommendations on what is good and bad for your health, for your gut health, specifically. And, you test it probably, I think the first year about 4 times. So you get kind of a balance, because your gut health will change depending on what you feed it. So
Mm-hmm.
it'll kind of, balance itself out. And then you can start to truly understand what's going to be best for your own gut and what's going to be best for your brain.
Mm-hmm.
That's something that should take more precedent over,
Mm-hmm.
this diet can be good for you when
Mm-hmm.
you don't even know what's best to be inside your system. And it really
Right.
causes, this big transition of, you could be feeding yourself something that's horribly wrong for you, and you don't necessarily know, unless you hear rumbles in your stomach or you have different digestive issues, which, there's many things that can hide under the rug in terms of nutrition that you might not necessarily know, especially if you're not getting any types of tests.
Right.
The last thing that I really want to speak about and transition to is, I'm not sure if you've heard about the app that Weight Watchers has been doing for children.
Mm-hmm.
And
Yes.
yeah, that transitions, very well, as you were speaking about weight being such a big, placeholder for people to, judge others, judge themselves, and try to,
Mm-hmm.
bring others and themselves down based on these issues. Obviously this application for children is not right, and children should not be focusing on their weight and such. But,
Mm-hmm.
can you give your own opinion and, what you've heard throughout this app, just to
Yeah.
bring more awareness, because I don't think many people are hearing about it, but there's definitely a big awareness against it right now throughout social media and
Mm-hmm.
people I've been connecting with. But, what is your opinion on this? And, how
Yeah.
can we move forward to try to negate that weight is something that children at such a young age should be curious and understanding about?
Yeah. Yeah, I've been appreciating some of the backlash that has been out there about this app. And I mean, I think I would want to start by saying that um, I I think it's important to validate and empathize with the concern that a lot of parents have about their children's health. I think, as as a parent myself, I certainly can relate to. You want to give your child the very best opportunity to be in good health, and the messages that parents are getting are, of course, the same ones that we're all getting, that that a lower weight equals a healthier body and healthier mind. And that is actually like the fundamental error in all of this, is that we've taught parents, and as well as even medical professionals, that kind of the key to well-being is being at a low body weight, or being or experiencing a lot of weight loss. And that's just fundamentally wrong. I mean, the research does not support that. And there's a lot of good stuff out there that that indicates how wrong that is, but that still is the narrative that we have. So I always want to just like start from this place of understanding like what the drivers of this are, from the kind of caregiver perspective, and that I think this is. But when we're talking about kids that may be in higher weight bodies, they are so vulnerable. That's what's particularly heartbreaking, is that they're so vulnerable in so many ways to these kind of quote unquote interventions, because even people that want to do what's best for them, can inadvertently cause harm to them by introducing something like a diet app. So, I mean, one of the things I go back to is it was a huge win from my perspective that a couple of years ago, the American Academy of Pediatrics said, doctors, parents, do not talk to your kids about weight. That's not helpful. It's more likely to create disordered eating and problems with eating. And yet we have this app that comes out that's asking kids to make a plan about how they're going to handle being offered a piece of cake at a birthday party, and has these big red X's over really normal foods like hummus that we, want our kids to be eating, and tells them that that's dangerous for them. And so it sort of goes against the philosophy that I try to teach, which is that all foods fit into a healthy, normalized, balanced approach to food. And we don't categorize food as good and bad. And, we think about what helps us feel good and what our bodies are telling us. And so when we put such a potentially powerful tool in the hands of kids, they, of course, not only in using it, but internalize it over time. And it just sets them up for such a disordered relationship to trust the app and not trust their body, or to, categorize food as completely off limits and then become very fearful and have these issues around what's good for their bodies. But maybe most importantly, actually tells them something. I'm giving you this app because something is wrong with you. Something is wrong with the way that you look and your health and well-being. And so this is what's going to fix it. And I think the danger of that and that messaging that something is wrong with you and we need to fix it because you're in a different body shape, size than someone else, is the most damaging thing that we can do and has a far greater risk than being in a larger body. So I'm very obviously not in support of the app myself. And I think I kind of come back to just this idea that, if Weight Watchers was all that effective, it wouldn't still be around after all of these decades. If everybody was so successful at using their plans and losing weight, then they wouldn't be such a profitable business. So their business model is actually founded on the idea that 95% approximately of people that diet will regain the weight plus some. So they've rebranded themselves a number of times, and I think that tells us something too. So they're kind of trying to keep current by being more of this wellness brand, but at the heart of it, I think we have to look more closely and see that it's diet culture that is kind of perpetuating all of these disordered relationships with food and ourselves. So that's my rant.
No, much needed, because the conversation I think needs to continue, especially with this leap into trying to educate children as well. And really, I don't think they're educating them; they're causing harm. This brings up a big concept that is in comparison to how a lot of people experience trauma at their youth. And for many people, it's this this idea that they have to be someone or be something, whether it's due to how they were brought up in their childhood. So whether it's drawn out through their parents or whether it's drawn out through their friends, people they surround themselves with. Oftentimes there's things such as, telling them about their weight, or even if it's an experience that they have, many different traumas, whether it's physical, emotional, or mental, all of these different harming ways of emotional abuse, of physical abuse, these can cause very drastic coping mechanisms throughout, 10, 15 years throughout the line of their own life. And, this Weight Watchers app for children kind of seems like it could be displaced as another opportunity for them to lead the children back into, whether it's the adult Weight Watchers or even just having different emotional, mechanisms of them, different emotional responses that these children can bring about 10 years down the line, which I'm very worried about. But, what are some other types of, whether it's behavioral or emotional responses that people can really succumb to and really be caused by some of these traumatic experiences, whether it's emotional abuse or physical abuse? What are some of the different responses that you've seen that maybe, whether it's within an eating disorder as well, how can someone become aware and identify that they have an emotional response that might not necessarily be best for themselves, and that it could be something that they need to change through in a therapy session or just throughout their lifestyle changes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that there are, of course we have the kind of clinical symptoms of something like PTSD, where somebody is experiencing more what we call re-experiencing symptoms like flashbacks or nightmares. They're really kind of visually seeing these traumatic events that have happened to them, maybe have, significant mood shifts and things like that. But I think what you're referring to, which is really important, is the fact that for a lot of people, they may not meet criteria for PTSD or have some of those types of symptoms, but a lot of the, what I would say is the sort of belief systems that kind of accompany the experience of having traumatic events or relationships over time really start to shape somebody's view of themselves. And that often then translates into the way that they interact with the world, the way that they treat their own body, the way that they experience events in kind of present day. So, some things that I think I often see, maybe first and foremost, is like recognizing that when a child or a young person experiences what I would consider, emotional trauma, or certainly things like verbal or physical abuse. For example, even not as a child, but that oftentimes what happens is we don't really have any framework for understanding like why that's happening or any greater context to put that into. And so what we see is that people tend to can only understand that as kind of a function of themselves, even if that doesn't, 30 years later make any rational sense. But we as kids, when we're sort of in that ego state and we believe that sort of we are responsible for everything, we can internalize this idea that something that I have done or failed to do is creating this situation or outcome for me. And so I think that I'm thinking about a lot of the people that I've treated over the years with eating disorders and others, who sort of walk around the world with that internalization and believing that there might be something fundamentally wrong with them, or the way that they, or aspects of their personality are like inherently bad. Maybe because something as quote unquote simple as they had a parent who just had a completely different temperament than them. I have one of my kids has a completely different temperament than I do. And fortunately I'm like somewhat aware of this stuff. So I try to be really mindful of that, but it's hard, when you maybe don't connect in the same way because you're so different. But it's one thing to kind of acknowledge those differences. And it's another, I think what a lot of people have experienced is they came to internalize that as like these qualities about myself are bad or wrong or frustrating or push people away. And so they might hide those qualities about themselves or feel a lot of guilt or shame. And we know that then shame in particular can translate into all kinds of really harmful behaviors if we're not, kind of bringing that into the light. So, I think that there's all kinds of ways that these things can manifest, but what I think is maybe most important is kind of recognizing, like you're bringing up, the fact that trauma, as we describe it, isn't necessarily an isolated event, or oftentimes it's much more relational, or the way that we kind of learn to experience ourselves, or what we experience over time with like people that are important to us. So, and I think some of the best things that we can do. I mean, obviously I'm a big therapy advocate, but therapy is not the only solution. One, I think talk therapy is not the only solution and isn't right for everybody, and that there's all kinds of more body-based therapies, as well as other things that we can do to like develop healthy relationships, being in a supportive community and things like that that sometimes can be equally important to kind of healing those parts of ourselves that are really wounded.
Definitely. Those are, I think, a lot of, valuable and important things to surround yourself with. Environment is definitely a big thing, obviously.
Mm-hmm.
Displaced due, because a lot of trauma is in turn due to a lot of child's environments and how they're treated, how their relationships go into play. So it's definitely, once you have that awareness and responsibility, it's important to surround yourself with some of the most important, people and environments that you need. As
Mm-hmm.
well, to, bring in, my own experience. Actually, when I was about 12, I experienced an emotional abuse that I wasn't even aware of. And
Mm-hmm.
kind of, it happened. It wasn't necessarily something that dramatically changed me.
Mm-hmm.
But as that went throughout the course of my life, it changed the way that I was, behaving with other people. So due to, what happened to me emotionally, it in turn changed the way that I had relations with, all of my partners. So within my partners, or within people that I was friends with, I was abused and I was, emotionally hurt. And then I was displacing that upon other people.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And, I didn't even become aware of that as I was going throughout this. I just thought, whether I was just an angry person or this is just who I was, this is just how
Mm-hmm.
it went about. And then, come 4, 5, 6 years later, as I've, become more self-aware and understood, I do a lot of journaling, a lot of meditating to think, why do I behave and why do I respond the way that I do based on, things that were predisposed in my childhood. And
Right.
it brings the awareness of, maybe that one period of time is truly what caused me to do something 8 years later, or what
Mm-hmm.
caused me to, react this way with someone else. And I think that, brings about the important concept that, there's many things that you aren't even aware of
Mm-hmm.
5 years later that, or 5 years before, that can drastically change how you react and
Mm-hmm.
you respond to other people, which I think, becoming aware of that is so important. But, I spoke about journaling and meditating a little bit, but, whether it's through your therapy session, what are some ways that you're able to, become more aware of these behaviors or responses? How do you help someone become more self-aware just with their
Mm-hmm.
emotions, their behaviors, and how they go about throughout the day? Because I think that's something that a lot of people do struggle with, is, understanding the cause of, how they're feeling and how they're acting.
Yeah. Yeah. I think self-awareness is one of those things that it's can be such a catch-22, because you have to have some grain of it to even be interested in learning about yourself. But I think most of us really want, of course, to understand ourselves and to build that awareness, and we want to have, healthy, good relationships and treat people well. And um, I kind of quote unquote prescribe a lot of journaling, as you mentioned you do. I think many of us are just not that great at being able to kind of take that outsider perspective of ourselves. And so, that's why that's one of the major reasons that I think therapy is as effective as it is it's allowing somebody to provide, in a hopefully really compassionate but direct way, feedback about how you are presenting to the world, and what your interactions might look like. But I think it's really powerful to ask people to get that feedback from other people in their lives as well, once they can tolerate it. Sometimes it's always hard to hear the not so great things about ourselves, but when we can start really being open and curious about that, about like, how is the way that I'm showing up affecting you, and what feedback can you give me about how I, engage with the world? I mean, there's nothing more powerful than that if we can swallow it. I use a modality of treatment called radically open dialectical behavior therapy, which is a lot of words, but one of the really powerful kind of tools that comes from RODBT is something called self-inquiry, and it's kind of a meditative practice that you can either do like with another person or on your own, writing. And if somebody's interested in it, I mean, I have a blog post about it, kind of how to get started with it. But it's a really powerful process, I think, of just starting to like ask yourself about, in a gentle but firm way, why do I react the way that I do to this particular situation? And what I think is really powerful about it is it's not about, the goal of the exercise isn't to come up with like a concrete answer, like, this is exactly why, and I can write this like dissertation on why I am the way that I am. It's actually more about the curiosity and the questioning, because those are the skills, kind of openness and flexibility and curiosity, that we can translate into the rest of our lives to understand, like, how am I reacting? How am I responding? What's the most effective thing to do in this situation? How do I engage in this relationship in a way that's like true to my values and who I am and the way that I would like to see it play out? So I love self-inquiry and just like helping people kind of get to a place where they're more reflective about their own kind of interactions.
I completely agree. I think that's one of the most, valuable skills that I've had. That was the one thing, even before I was really self-aware and even, focused on my mental health. I was, in places where I had and experienced many mental health challenges, but still having that curiosity and that ability to reflect, I think, is so important. And that's something that I've, been fortunate enough to have throughout this, because, I think asking those questions and reflecting on, your past as well can be so informative, and just, taking the steps forward and really bringing about, what you can change within your life. It's definitely something that I think many people do struggle with. And that's why therapy, I think, is so important. And, I always tell people, like, no matter what, even if you're not experiencing a mental health challenge, therapy can still open up doors or windows
Right.
that you might never be able to understand.
Right. I mean, I think therapy has become so associated with, I have this major problem or crisis in my life and I need to talk to somebody, rather than approaching it like, how do I, develop myself, or, protect, or, think sort of ahead about my mental wellness and effectiveness. And so there's all kinds of benefits to like getting that perspective.
Perfect. And just to touch on as well, that blog that you mentioned, we'll make sure to have that in the show notes so everybody can
Cool.
be linked towards that. So we'll make sure that they can have that, and any other resources that we've spoken about thus far within the episode, to make sure that they have availability to it as well. The really question that I love to ask my guests to wrap up this interview process, it brings into perspective of your whole life story and your experiences. So I want you to put into place that you're writing a book about your whole life story, and each chapter can be a different time frame, a different period, or it can be just experiences and lessons that you've learned throughout your time thus far. I want you to, take the time to pick out one chapter that was truly profound, or that was, something that will truly last within my audience's, perspective of this interview. So, give us a glimpse into one chapter that was very, impactful, and just tell us why that was such a profound moment within your own life.
What an amazing question. Oh, goodness. Let me have just a second to think about that, if that's okay.
Yeah, please do.
Um, okay, I don't know what the title of this chapter would be exactly, but it would be some play on, there's an Aristotle quote that, well, at least often gets attributed to him, that says, if you want to avoid criticism, say nothing, do nothing, be nothing. And I think that would be the theme of this chapter. And I think it, I think in my own life and experience, I just recognize that I spent so much time kind of saying nothing or doing nothing in order to, or actually doing a lot of things, but all the things that I thought were what I was supposed to be doing and what was going to get sort of the most reinforcement or accolades or what people would approve of, which then translated into essentially being nothing of who I really was at my core. And I spent a lot of time kind of eating up I got a lot of praise and was a good student and, did all the right things. And I think a lot of women in particular can relate to that experience. We know the rules and we can follow them really well. And I think this chapter would cover kind of the evolution of getting to a place of recognizing that avoiding criticism, which to me, I think translates to like feeling disconnected, which is, I think, all of our most basic human fear is being rejected and disconnected. I was so afraid of that I, wasn't really creating who I was. And so I think the nice little fairy tale ending, although it's never a fairy tale ending, is that I feel like I'm finally doing that in my life, saying the things that I was afraid to say. I think back to that postdoc, like that I mentioned earlier, that I got, this offer rescinded. And I think, what would they think now about like the things that I put out on social media or, in blog posts or the way that I talk. And actually, like, it makes me really proud to think, I hope they'd be really horrified because I'm actually like speaking truth. Mm-hmm. And, I've done that. I think there's so many more ways that I need to do that, but I'm trying to kind of live that each day, of not being willing to be nothing for the sake of other people's comfort. So that's what I would say.
That's awesome. Thank you so much for that answer, Ashley. I think it puts into perspective of, your goals and what message you're trying to really convey to women, especially, and to try to, empower people to be them true selves, to share their truth and not, succumb to a lot of what we've been speaking about of, the societal norms and just who you should be, rather of, who you want to be and how you want to convey it. So, I thank you for that honest message and for taking this time out to be the 39th guest on the Mental Insights podcast. I really appreciate taking the time with me, and it was such a pleasure to speak with you and share some of the insights within mental health. I think we'll definitely have, another time to really dissect more about, what's happening within the mental health field and what else we can do to move forward to continue the important conversation within mental health.
Thank you. It's been like such a real pleasure, genuinely, to talk with you.